Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Natasha Ali and I'm the acting CEO of the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation. Thank you all for joining us on a rather chilly winter afternoon. I know it's silly to think that winter would be cold, but it's just such a stark contrast to the last few days where it's been unseasonably warm. But I guess that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, climate change. For those of you who didn't join us for the first installment, welcome to the Unfinished Business of Liberation webinar series. This is done in partnership with the Tambo Foundation and our friends at Absa Bank and the Zola Square African Social Policy Innovation at UCT. The webinar series sets out to delve into the discrepancies between the ideals and intentions set out pre-liberation, what we wanted liberation to look like pre-94, and the lived reality of the majority of South Africans 27 years later. The first dialogue looked at the Constitution as the home of, the socio-economic rights we hold so dear. And as we progress, we seek to look at land reform and gender parity. But today, we're going to be looking at the effect of climate change on marginalized communities, delving into climate justice. And I know you didn't come here to listen to me, but I do want to thank ABSA and UCT and the Zola Square African Social Policy Innovation. And I want to say that although he wasn't necessarily talking about climate change, Oliver Tambo said, we have a last chance to avert a disaster which could cripple our country for centuries to come. In this regard, we have little choice but to live up to our responsibilities and engage one another in an honest and serious dialogue. So thank you for joining us. I hope the dialogue far exceeds your expectations. If you're posting about it, please tag the foundation at Tambo Foundation across all social media platforms. Please use the hashtag Tambo Webinar Series. And we look forward to your questions. You can just type them in the Q&A box in the corner, and we will be posing these to the panelists when we're done. So thank you very much. And I now hand over to Professor Noyo, if he's here, to just say a word from our sponsors.
Thank you so much, Program Director, and good afternoon to the panelists. It's good to have your faces just popping up. And also good afternoon to the audience and well, the globe at large. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our second installment that begins to unpack the whole process of liberation that is not finished. As the adage says, it's not yet Uhuru. And I guess for us is to begin to critically examine some of these blockages and some of these impediments post-1994 and how they begin to amplify the inequalities, they amplify the poverty. These are actually the vestiges of colonialism and apartheid. And we ask the question, what do we need to do beyond what we have been doing since 1994? The government and civil society have done their part, and they continue to put in place so many measures aimed at uplifting the livelihoods of the marginalized in South Africa. So panelists, this is one of the things that we, or some of the, one of the phenomenon that we look at, which is sometimes not looked or critically examined as a development issue. But climate change, impacts every facet of our lives, and it's a privilege to have you here and honored to have you here, so that you will provide insights and perspectives on this issue. Program Director, I must also just apologize that I've got another engagement and I won't be available for the rest of the session, but I'd like to wish you fruitful deliberation and hope that your message will cut across into various facets of this society and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Prof. Noyo. I just want to quickly introduce the panel. We have a wonderful panel, and I'm really happy that it is an all-women panel. It wasn't by design, but it is the most delightful accident, I must say. I think we're very cognizant at the foundation of always having, women on the panel, Black women on the panel, and when something just happens that so beautifully comes together, we're so grateful. I want to introduce you to Tasneem Issop, who is currently the Executive Director of Climate Action Network International. Tasneem has also just completed her second term as Commissioner of the National Planning Commission in South Africa, appointed by the President, and she leads the work on climate change and the just transition. One thing I don't like at webinars is when people read bios endlessly, so I'm going to keep it brief. Tasneem, thank you so much for joining us today. Our second panelist is Retumetse Molotswane. She is the Program Director of Climate Change and Energy at the NBI, the National Business Initiative. She was formerly the Director of Mitigation Response Analysis and the Director of Climate Change Priority Programs at the South African National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So Retumetse, thank you very much for joining us and for bringing the business perspective into today's discussion. Our final panelist is Tatenda Mubonde, who is a LLM. She has an LLM from Wits, and her research focused on artisanal and small-scale mining and the notion of equitable access to mineral resources in the South African MPRDA. Tatenda is now an attorney designate in the mining department for the Center for Environmental Rights. So thank you, Tatenda, for joining us. And our facilitator today is Dr. Melanie Murcott, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Public Law at the University of Pretoria. She teaches administrative and environmental law. And Melanie has been very tirelessly working on this subject for us. Thank you so much for agreeing to facilitate today's discussion. I'm so excited. I'm stepping away now and I'm handing over to you until the question and answer session. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to the audience.
Thanks, Natasha. It's wonderful to be here. And it's really exciting to engage with business and human rights lawyers and people in government about the current climate crisis. And before we get into the question and answers, I think it's important just to set the scene and work out for ourselves, what are we talking about when we speak of climate justice and climate injustice? Now, many of us will be familiar with the concept of environmental justice and as a response to environmental injustice. And that concept is all about recognizing that environmental benefits, things like land for housing, water for drinking, are goods of the earth that are unevenly distributed in the world. And they are particularly unevenly distributed in South Africa. So environmental justice is about recognizing that reality. Clean air is unevenly distributed. In Johannesburg, we recently had some sulfurous smells coming into the northern suburbs, and people were outraged. And we know that in other parts of the country, people live with this environmental injustice on a daily basis of being surrounded by dirty and indeed deadly air. So this concept has been around since the civil rights movement in the US, and it took off as recognizing that Black people are disproportionately affected by environmental harms and receive the least access to environmental benefits. And emerging from and related to that concept more recently is the concept of climate justice, recognizing the idea of climate injustice, which was really about the unjust distribution of climate change vulnerabilities and impacts, as well as the systemic and structural underlying causes of those injustices, including exclusion of people from participation in decision-making about climate change and a disproportionate experience of vulnerability. The concept of climate injustice reminds us that the climate crisis that we are currently facing around the globe, in our country as well, is not only a technical issue and not only a scientific issue, but is also a moral or ethical and a political issue related to the distribution of climate change impacts and the causes of climate change. And the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, tells us that climate change represents at least a triple injustice. So first, most climate change casualties, and consequently those most at risk, are poor people. Secondly, poor people are suffering the consequences of climate change, but are essentially powerless to stop it. Because industrialized nations and big business are largely responsible for the problem, but continue to burn fossil fuel at will, which exacerbates the impact of climate change. Thirdly, developed nations are refusing to incur the costs of addressing the impacts of climate change. So those are some of the global implications of recognizing climate injustice as a political and ethical issue. And those are not my views, those are UNESCO's views after in-depth study on the impacts of climate change. But climate change also has implications within countries and at a grassroots level. And this is illustrated by the fact that the poorest 40% of the world's population, which is around 2.6 billion people, will be consigned to a future involving diminished opportunity as inequalities within countries are exacerbated. In other words, the world's poor, who are already socially, economically, and environmentally vulnerable, are likely to feel the impacts of climate change first and most severely. And these impacts will then hamper efforts to attain social justice, which is really at the heart of the country's liberation struggle, social justice. So climate change is a massive threat to social justice, and recognizing the justice dimensions of climate change is an important part of pursuing the unfinished business of the liberation struggle. So with that short introduction to frame climate justice as an aspect of climate change and the climate crisis we face, I wanted to put to our three panelists a very short, it's a 1-minute video to just put all of this into real life issues and then ask some questions about the video. So I'm going to do that now.
I actually don't even have a place to go, so I think I'm gonna have to stay a while with some friends.
All right, so my question to the panelists arising from that short video is, first of all, to Tatenda. Tatenda, what are some of the human rights implications of climate change? How are they exemplified by this video? And perhaps you can kick us off from there.
I think that this video is actually quite good in illustrating some of the disproportionate impacts of climate change that people are going to face. So as we all know, a lot of people do isolate climate change from other human rights that people are constitutionally given in the South African Bill of Rights. But then these issues are interlinked. People are living in unequal lives in South Africa. South Africa is generally not just it's generally in an equal society, and there's lots of environmental injustices. And these are some of the impacts where if there's flooding, who's most affected? Some people don't even stay in those areas, close to those areas that will be most affected if there's a flood or a rise in sea levels. But those who do are most affected. And the unfortunate part is they don't even have anywhere else to go. Like the woman was saying, I don't have anywhere else to go, so I have to stay. So basically, during that time, they're not only going to suffer from the poverty that they already live every day, they're now going to be impacted by the fact that their homes are flooded, they can't access any other place, they can't go anywhere else, and no aid is coming to help them. That's just how unequal our society is. And it's normally those people who are poor who end up living undignified life, who end up having their rights to security and being protected, not being given to them due to just where they are, and that society has not allowed them to be integrated and be like everybody else. Thank you.
Thanks. I think, as you mentioned, some of the, if we can accept that this flood is one of the many implications of our current climate crisis as an extreme weather event, we can see that there's loss of access to housing, there's loss of access to sanitation, there's loss of dignity, there's definitely been loss of life. So all of those human rights are implicated, and so protecting the environmental right then becomes a key aspect of ensuring the fulfillment of all of these other rights. To Tasneem and Retumete, I wanted to pose to you your thoughts on the government's response. So one of the responses we see is a disaster risk management spokesperson, Charlotte Powell, saying the settlement is in a detention pond and no practical or reasonable remedies are available. So what is your reaction to that response? And is it the case that there's no practical or reasonable remedies available for these people? And is that how the government ought to be responding? And then also, what are some of your thoughts on how business ought to respond to this crisis?
I can, Tasneem, are you going first?
Okay, yeah. So thanks, Melanie, and thanks for sharing that video. You know, this is exactly sharply visualizing the most critical unfinished business of the liberation. And that is exactly the fact that we've not managed to address poverty and inequality at the levels in which it needed to be addressed. This is the biggest unfinished business of our liberation, that we have not achieved economic freedom, and specifically economic freedom for the majority in the country. So, of course, when you look at the impacts of climate change, which will exacerbate existing problems like poverty and inequality, as the video demonstrates, you know, that is something that therefore becomes, you know, the unfinished business becomes more and more urgent. It needs to be finished. So when a government official, who happens to be a disaster risk management official, the irony of that, has a callous response in the way it has. You know, this is a technical, official, bureaucratic response to the plight of the poor. It is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. And so what kind of response would we have needed from government, whether it's national, provincial, or local? Firstly, of course, the proactive measures to deal with climate change is necessary. So how do we adapt and build resilience to this crisis that's already happening? Not something in the future, it's happening, it's real, and it's devastating people's lives and livelihoods. So what do you do? Well, there is no problem in addressing poverty that will at the same time address the issues of vulnerability to climate impacts. So the basic things that you've mentioned, for example, Melanie, the issue of providing proper housing to people, basic, you're building resilience. And this housing would be in safe places that is climate proofed, and for the future. The fact that people need access to healthcare, a basic thing. We now experience this through COVID, but it's a basic resilience building issue to climate change as well. Education, and especially education for women and girls, is a critical part of building resilience. So the overall building of resilience to the vulnerabilities of climate impacts is at the same time the building or redressing of poverty and inequality in the country. For too long, our government and others in the country have viewed these as polar opposites, that we have to achieve our development objectives first before we address anything. That is a false argument. The solutions to address the climate impact are the exact solutions to addressing poverty and inequality in this country. And so that unfinished business needs to be finished pretty soon. It's becoming extremely urgent.
So I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Ritsumitsu.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both what Tatenda and Tasneem have said. I think climate change in this particular case reminds us of the journey that we still need to complete, and it just exacerbates, it deepens some of those inequalities and the injustices that we still need to address. And I agree, I think it's an opportunity to address what we know we need to address, and perhaps bringing in some additional resources that are found in this climate change conversation and climate change space. So that for me, that's where I see the opportunity, the interlinkages between addressing climate change as a vehicle for advancing our country's developmental objectives and really bringing everybody into benefiting from South Africa that is competitive, a South Africa that values its people and kind of manifests that sentiment in how we treat people. But that in general, at a very high level, is the sentiment that I would like to hear from my government as well when dealing with our fellow citizens. From a business perspective, I had the good fortune that I'm working on a project at the moment that's focusing specifically on how do you bring private sector into building South Africa's resilience. And I think there's a very nice example where business was actually working with local government to build up the capacity that's needed to reduce the level of risk. So, for example, in a flood situation, where you're able to get early warning up in place and see what preventative measures can be taken, and understanding if there's an increase in frequency and intensity, how do we manage that before the disaster actually takes place. So from that perspective, I do think that's a lovely example of how business can be a positive force. I think as a member of community, as a member of building South Africa in general, in addition to focusing on very specific projects that can also help their own resilience, and position business as a force for good in community.
Thanks. One of the other things that interested me about the video, and we have to credit Ground Up for putting it on social media, is that the statements made by both the disaster risk management official and the MACO member for human settlements both seem to place the blame for the situation on the poor, on the people who are experiencing the problem and who are the most vulnerable and in most desperate need. And I think appreciate hearing from each of you, and we can start with Tatenda. Who or what is responsible for this situation, and what do we think of, from a climate justice perspective, of placing the blame for this problem that is being experienced on the poor because they've unlawfully occupied the land?
I think the blame should not be on the people, because what is actually causing most of the climate change effects is not their activities, but mostly it's activities of big industries and big businesses. For example, a big business like Eskom, they emit lots of air pollution every single day, and they're affecting people who are living in the nearby areas where their plants are. Now you can't be blaming people living in those areas for such air pollution because they're not the ones responsible for it. But the truth is, the people who are responsible for these negative impacts of whatever activities they are doing do not want to take that responsibility. They'll rather put the blame on other people and say, why are people living in close proximity to this thing? Why can't you move? If you're affected by this thing so much, why can't you move elsewhere? But I don't think that should be the discourse. The discourse should be, stop what you're doing, protect the lives of people. But that's not what's happening. And I think we need to face that reality and go exactly where the problem is, because sometimes we try to we think the solution is in moving people and telling them to build better houses, and telling them to go and stay at a much better place with cleaner air. But the solution is actually talking to big business and telling them, comply with the law, stop what you're doing, protect the lives of people. So I think that's where the blame is, big business and government not making sure that these people comply with the laws that they're supposed to. Thank you.
Thanks. Tasneem, would you like to give us a more global perspective, perhaps, on where responsibility lies for this kind of situation?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And absolutely building off what Tatenda just said, you know, and your introduction about the concept of climate justice. And so those responsible for this crisis, you know, rich industrialized nations, big business, not just the fossil fuel industry, but big agriculture, etc., they are responsible for the crisis. It's not the person living in Bloekombos experiencing the impacts. Absolutely not. And then in addition, of course, it's not, of course, the, you know, rich nations and their industrialization off the back of fossil fuels causing the crisis historically. But today, we contribute to the crisis as well as South Africa. So let's not pretend that we are only a victim of climate change. We are a contributor to climate change as well. And so the moral and ethical issue that you raised earlier, the issues of social justice apply to us as well. And so certainly at the global level, countries have come together to look at, you know, a global agreement to address climate change. Like many global agreements, it's still not being implemented properly, right? And so, no, you don't blame the victim of climate change. You go and target those responsible. Firstly, rich nations have to take responsibility that they've committed to poorer countries. In turn, poorer countries must ensure that it is exactly the people who are impacted the most and have contributed the least to this crisis who are going to get the funding to save lives, to build resilience, etc. So there's a whole train of responsibility that we need to look at. In the end, it is for sure not that woman in Bloekombos who is responsible. It's all those who are actually emitting and causing the crisis, and then also not redressing the crisis and treating it like a crisis, that will have to be held responsible.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a powerful illustration of saying that someone who has nowhere else to go should be held to account for something that they're not responsible for, and that's what climate justice allows us to acknowledge who's responsible and who's experiencing the impacts. Retumetse, your comment?
I think South Africa is a really interesting country when it comes to talking about climate justice, and I think Tazim highlighted some of those issues. The nature of the South African economy traditionally, and the context within which it's been embedded. So, an economy that traditionally benefited a few at the expense of many. And I think it's a very interesting parallel to what happens globally. So you do have those dynamics of a very well-developed world in South Africa, as well as a country that, at least a component of the country that can be equated to your least developed world, and those dynamics of who bears responsibility. My view is that the same principles that we apply as a country and that we kind of uphold internationally in being able to assign responsibility to those who are emitting, high levels of greenhouse gas emissions that will have an impact on future generations. I think that we need to be consistent in applying that. I think to some extent it is embedded in our laws, but I do think that in addition to being something that has regulatory backing, producer pays principles and things like that, there's an opportunity here as a country to maybe take a different position. We know that we are still in the process of building what should be an equitable South African one that takes care of people, and that work is not done. And I think it's important to adopt the position that helps us to go forward. And it's not to say that those who are responsible should deny that responsibility. We should take note of that responsibility, but also take it, I think, from the opportunity that is presented to play an active and productive role in actually building what should be and what could be a great country. We're positioned in so many ways to be able to lead, and it's up to the different stakeholders in the country to be able to acknowledge, guilt, to acknowledge blame, but also to see those as opportunities for where we can actually do something productive. And from where I'm coming from, I've had that opportunity just to see some companies who are taking a very proactive role in addressing some of those issues, and understanding that they could be really difficult and in many cases quite daunting, but the courage is needed to be able to do what needs to be done, and to acknowledge the responsibility that we all have to fellow citizens, I think, within the country, but also acknowledging that climate change has a global impact, and that there are developing communities within our own country, but they're also developing communities in other countries that our own consumption patterns and our own behaviors are also affected. So this idea of being able to acknowledge responsibility and use it as a power base to actually be able to address and change behaviors, I think is something that's really, really important.
Great, thanks. Then I have a few questions about the law, but before we get to that, a little bit on economics, since we've touched on it already. Do we think that our current neoliberal capitalist paradigm can facilitate any kind of just transition or climate justice in South Africa? And if so, how? And Retumetse, I'll start with you, since you've got the closest connection to business.
I think approaches to economic development that are intensively extractive and not recognizing that there is a price to pay for everything that we take from the earth, that's not going to take us very far. The challenge that we face as a country is that there has to be a transition in the way that we undertake our own economic activity. And it has to acknowledge that there are implications for being resource intensive. There are implications for emitting emissions. And I think to some extent those have been acknowledged in the law, but perhaps not to the extent that they need to be. So, I don't think I can get into a bigger debate, philosophical debate, in terms of which approach you need to actually take, to grow an economy and to bring the people with it. But I do think that at the heart of any activity that we undertake in terms of economic development, it is the acknowledgement that there is a price to pay for how we use resources. And at the forefront of the approach that we take is an acknowledgement that it has to be the right people who pay that price. And for me, that's really the basis of how you achieve justice. There is nothing for free, and we have to acknowledge the price that is due at the end of undertaking any particular developmental path.
Thanks. I want to quote briefly from the Climate Justice Charter that has been adopted by a number of South African NGOs, and direct this at Tasneem. So one of the principles that's articulated in the Climate Justice Charter, and it's a 2020 document, non-binding, more inspirational, I think, aimed at creating awareness amongst civil society, business, and government. It says on the topic of decoloniality, it says colonial, neo-colonial, and imperial domination are driving us towards extinction. This is based on the worship of extractivism, technology, finance, violence, and markets. We will actively de-link from this system as we affirm an emancipatory relationship between humans with non-human nature rooted in our history, culture, knowledge, and the wider struggle of the oppressed on planet Earth. What's your reaction to that idea, and how can we bring it into climate change policy and its implementation?
No, thanks very much. That particular clause absolutely resonates with me. We do have to get to the root causes of the crisis, and not just the climate crisis. We're just living through a global pandemic that has sharply demonstrated and made visible all the fault lines in our economies and our societies. And these things are interlinked. You cannot separate them, because the problem with the climate crisis is a systemic problem. We need fundamental system change. And it's the very system that has caused the poverty and inequality crisis. It's the very system that is causing the climate crisis. It's the very system that is causing the vaccine apartheid crisis right now. And so we cannot have a siloed approach to all these. These are connected. So let's be talking truth here. When you ask, do you think we can address the issue of justice and just transition and the climate crisis through a capitalist neoliberal model or system? No, we can't. It is exactly that system that has caused the crisis in the first place. And let's remember what Einstein said about these things, right? Let us not be foolish. Let us not think that we are going to be able to address the crisis through the very system that has caused the crisis. So no, it can't. And therefore that clause in the Climate Justice Charter is fundamentally important. And what I like about it, because I'm from that generation, when I was a younger generation, let me say, that was totally inspired by and respected and just adored leaders like Oliver Tambo and others of his generation. Sorely missed that kind of leadership. Selfless, dedicated to the service of people, understood that what our duty was to take care of the poor and downtrodden. We've lost those values. And so why have we lost those values? Because we've bought into this notion that we are, our economy needs to be a market-driven economy. We have to be tied into the global economy, who forces all kinds of conditionalities. And we've lost the tenets of the Freedom Charter. So the Climate Justice Charter resonates with me because it resonates with me in relation to the Freedom Charter and the aspirations that we had during our liberation struggle in the country. And we've lost our way. So absolutely, we need to fundamentally change the economic structures in the country, the economic system in the country, and our current understanding of what development means and development pathways. We have really, there's no time to waste, because all of these crises require fundamental shifts and radical shifts. It's not going to be incremental. And that's the unfinished business of our liberation. We have to go back to being radical, true to our values and true to the aspirations that we fought for in this country. And we have just deserted the poor and downtrodden because we've bought into a neoliberal capitalist model.
Thanks. It's a very strong answer, and the passion really comes through. And we do need everyone listening today and everyone who will listen to this in the future or think about this problem to think about it from that need to be radical, to be insurgent, to be innovative. Otherwise, you know, ultimately our extinction is a reality. And of course, poor people will suffer first and hardest, but we will all suffer. I think one of the things that Tasneem's comment made me reflect on was how on paper in the law, there is, we often see a commitment towards social justice and innovation. And we're just not seeing that translate into reality. And one of the examples I'll share with you now so that we can get into a bit of a conversation about the law and bring Tatenda into the discussion a bit more. So you should be able to see on the screen the preamble of the Climate Justice Bill. And this bill was published in 2018, and there was a call for comments, and we are continuously getting promises that the bill will become a reality. The bill is overall, it's a plan about a plan. It's saying that government must make plans about how to address adaptation and mitigation challenges, such as the adaptation challenge we saw in the video earlier. And one of the things that struck me was the massive contrast between the reaction of the government to the plight of the people in the video and this preamble. So here we see that everyone has the right to dignity, life, and an environment not harmful to their health or well-being. That's in our constitution. And we recognize in this bill that anthropogenic, human-induced climate change represents an urgent threat to human societies and the planetary environment and requires an effective response. And then we also see how we're especially vulnerable, and there's a recognition that people's dignity and life can be affected, but then we're not seeing that translate into the responses, and we're seeing a very narrow approach in the responses. So it brings us to a question about for Tatenda about what is the role of the law in responding to climate change and what are some of its limits. And feel free to share with us some of the work you're doing with the Center for Environmental Rights, or that the Center is doing more broadly in response to climate change vulnerabilities and climate injustices.
Thanks, Melanie. I think my immediate response to your question is the law does play a great role in climate justice and, you know, protecting the lives of people. But also the thing that we see normally in practice in my work at the center is that government does not necessarily do what they're supposed to do or what the law says they should do. So, for example, the Constitution gives the government an obligation to make sure that people's environmental rights are protected and to ensure sustainable economic development and all of that. But then government does not necessarily take that duty seriously. So the law says one thing, but in practice or in reality, an opposite thing happens. So I'll just give an illustration. For example, one of the cases that the Center for Environmental Rights is working on is it's known as the deadly air case. This is basically one of the climate change sort of air pollution case that's happening in South Africa. And the background to that case is that in Mpumalanga, as some of you may know, this is like our biggest core region in South Africa. And there's about 12 of Eskom's coal-fired power stations and lots of coal mines in Mpumalanga, and also Sasol has some coal productions there as well. So what has been happening is that because of all the emissions that are from all the coal that's being burnt in that area, there's been deadly air pollution there, and a lot of people are losing their lives, and people are suffering from terminal illnesses as a result of this. So in 2007, the Mpumalanga Highfield region was declared as an air pollution priority area, which means that the government itself recognized that there is poor air pollution. There's poor air quality in Mpumalanga, and they saw the need to protect it, which is why they declared it as an air pollution priority area. But then what was supposed to happen after that declaration is that they're supposed to implement regulations on how they'll manage that area. But that has not been done until now. So at the center, one of the things that we've been doing is to try to get the government to comply with the law, because in terms of the National Air Quality Act, after you declare a place as an air pollution priority area, you're supposed to implement regulations on how you're going to manage that area. But they haven't done that, and it's over a decade now. So this is where the law comes into play, where you go and you can sue the government and say, it is your duty to make sure that air quality is managed in Mpumalanga, but you're not doing so. And as a result of your negligence, people are losing their lives. This is the kind of life they are living. Their health has been affected as a result of you not doing what you're supposed to do. And also the main thing about the deadly air case is that you're saying the poor air quality and the impacts on health that people are now suffering is a direct breach of Section 24 of the Constitution, which says everyone has a right to a healthy environment. And government is not doing anything about that, regardless of the fact that that same section says government has to implement measures to make sure that people's environmental rights are protected. So I think the law does play a great role in trying to ensure that people's lives are protected, and to hold government and any other authority that is responsible in securing people's lives and ensuring the minimization of climate change impacts accountable.
Great, thanks. I think we can applaud the work of the Center for Environmental Rights in terms of advancing climate justice for South Africans. And there's some questions that we'll come to a bit later about using human rights as a tool to advance climate justice, and a criticism or critique rather of it. So that's something to think about. But yeah, I think litigation is a brilliant way. It's one small and limited way, because it requires immense resources, and there aren't a lot of those in the country, but it's one way that we can hold government accountable to the commitments it is making. So going then to the commitments that government is making, everyone here will likely be aware of the idea that globally climate change has been recognized as an issue that requires attention. And as a result of this, in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted by 195 countries at a summit organized under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And at that summit, it was agreed, and this is translated into the Paris Agreement, that we need to hold the increase in global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. More recently, in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has urged law and policymakers to introduce measures that will prevent rises of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius than at present. So temperatures are rising too quickly, and things are changing at a rate that is much worse than we originally thought. And so this agreement then imposes obligations on states to respond to climate change. And my question, and we can, I think, start with Tasneem, is what is South Africa doing in response to the Paris Agreement? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the nationally determined contribution that has been published by our government and contains a number of commitments in terms of what it will do.
Thanks. Yeah, so these nationally determined contributions, NDCs, are, well, the Paris Agreement doesn't bind countries to deliver these, so they nationally determined, so bottom up supposed to be, based on the abilities of countries to do certain things in terms of climate. And so the NDCs now that the government is busy consulting around and will have to deliver are meant to be enhanced NDCs, as it's called. All countries have been called on in the second phase of submitting these nationally determined contributions to increase the levels of ambition. Because as you said, since the Paris Agreement, the science has become even more dire in terms of the warnings, and that now it's not, 1.5 is already dangerous, And so we do need to see countries, and especially those who are most responsible, coming back to the responsibility issue for the crisis, must, of course, increase their ambition. Whether South Africa's commitments that they're going to be putting forward is going to be in line with what we call at a global level their fair shares. There's an issue about, at a global level, there's issues of equity and fair shares as well, is something we would need to see. Now, I know that, South Africa is a really committed, multilateral actor. They've signed the Paris Agreement. They will fulfill the responsibilities in relation to that Paris Agreement. They will submit the NDCs. That's not at issue here. At issue is exactly what Tadenda raised earlier. When we come back home, then they have policies and practices that actually contradict what they are committing at an international level. We can just look at the recent problem with our energy decisions. And thank goodness the Department of Environmental Affairs and Forestry and Fisheries did not give the environmental license for Kapawa. So here we have an energy crisis in the country, an electricity crisis. We have alternatives that is green and sustainable, like renewable energy. And this government was going to choose to go with another fossil fuel, gas in this instance, through a contract that would have tied the country into a 20-year responsibility, financial responsibility. Fossil fuels. So yes, you're going to submit your NDC, but what are you doing back home in terms of especially your energy policies, and that is the issue. No doubt that South Africa will submit an enhanced NDC, will fulfill its obligations in terms of what the Paris Agreement has required of countries. And this is with all countries. It's not what they're doing in that space. It's what they're doing back home. The same thing goes with the UK government, for example, Melanie. They're going to host a COP. And right now they are wanting to issue licenses off the coast of Scotland for fossil fuels, after saying in the G7, for example, oh no, they're going to be phasing out of coal, etc. But no, the investments are still happening in fossil fuels all over the world. That's our challenge. So it's great to have a global agreement. It's the implementation since the adoption of the Paris Agreement that is the problem. And we're facing an emergency. Quite frankly, an emergency.
Thanks. Then Retumete, could you tell us a little bit about the work of National Treasury in response to the Paris Agreement and our nationally determined contributions, as well as your work around what business is doing in relation to the nationally determined contribution that South Africa is committed to?
So there's a project that we've been working on for about a year now, and this project is premised on making sure that South Africa achieves net zero by 2050, and that's in line with this ambition under the Paris Agreement. And what's really important here, so I'm understanding some of the issues based on what we commit to as a country and the level of implementation. And I think it's reflected again in the business world that what's required is cohesive action, cohesive and informed action. And so this project is about bringing business together to, I think, collectively about how do we actually transition our economy and taking that sectoral approach. So understanding in detail. So beyond very high level statements, to understand what are the steps that need to be taken, which decisions need to be taken, and by when. And then to provide a compelling fact-based to actually support that decision making. And I think what's notable about the project, one is that it is already premised on that net zero kind of goal by 2050. So that's the starting point. And I think we've been very successful working with Boots and BCG, just bringing in a lot of the businesses that do face quite a big challenge in terms of how they decarbonize in their own sectors. And I think so that's something that's been quite courageous, and bringing this together to make sure that we can come up with a picture that actually makes sense and is sufficiently granular to be able to implement. I think often we get caught out with very high level statements, and perhaps we haven't put in the degree of thinking around how you actually achieve these particular intents. And we've seen that. And I must say, I think from a government perspective, I think it's also part of the maturity of our country as a going country. Governance is not an easy thing. It's this country, South Africa, is extremely complex. I think it's like governing a range of different countries at once, and being able to come up with policies that respond to those different challenges in our society. So that is a very, very difficult thing to do. I could mention not specifically around climate change, but it speaks to the core of governance, of being able to hold parties together, of being able to envision, of being able to break down those very high level points into actionable steps at different levels, the national, provincial, local government, and individual action. And that's some of the work that we're doing at NBR with TANDEV, and focusing specifically on local government capacity that's needed, perhaps to implement. But in addition to that, I think, an important project and one that should help us to start to direct investment more systematically is the work that National Treasury is doing on the development of a green finance taxonomy. And this is work that started last year. It's come out of a sustainable finance initiative that National Treasury is leading with the financial sector in particular. And it's about how do you start to identify what is green. And I think further to that, National Treasury is also leading this work on then having a social component. So we understand the challenges around green projects and so forth, but all of those projects take place within a context. And we know that South Africa has very, very specific challenges and some very deep ones that need to be addressed. So I think that the work around the social taxonomy, being able to understand, yes, from a technological perspective, what is green is important, but being able to take into account what South Africa as a country needs and the challenges that we're facing, and be able to make that a core part of what this transition means, I think is work that's very important. It's still quite young, so it's going to take some time, but I do think we can applaud National Treasury in particular for being a bit more active, I think, in the climate space than they traditionally have been, and providing this leadership role. And I hope that it translates into some of the actions that in particular business takes in their investment choices.
Thanks so much. It's good to hear some of the positive things, but I'm going to be a little bit provocative and share with you this image and ask you, are we acting quick enough? Is government acting fast enough? Is business reacting fast enough? Or is this image the reality that we're currently in?
I mean, I can respond to that. We're definitely not acting fast enough. I think that's clear. The science backs it. And I think in our particular context, where those vulnerabilities are so deep already, superimposing this additional level of injustice and complexity just makes it even worse. So we're acting fast enough? No. At the scale that's required? No. Maybe from my perspective, I used to work in government. And so it's this ideal to make sure that the different ends of that triangle, so looking at society, government and business, are all working together to advance the urgent action that we need has brought me now to work with business. So as we edge along on, one point of that triangle, I personally have moved on to the next section that we need to get also moving very fast to address what you've said regularly throughout the session is an absolute emergency. It's a crisis that we need to respond to.
Great. Then Tatenda, could I ask you, with your work in advocacy in response to some of the mining activities we have in this country, what is your experience of engaging with business? And do you find it to be a constructive one? Is there space for constructive engagement in your experience as an environmental rights lawyer?
I think my experience has been mostly with the state, and the businesses that we work with, they are really against us because they think we are anti-development. And one of the statements that has been used is we are anti-development, anti-poor, and well, anti-Black, because of the kind of narrative we are trying to bring, the climate change narrative. Like, you need to consider these impacts and how they're going to affect the very same poor people that you're saying you're developing these projects for. But you're always tainted, and people now say, oh, these activists. But the truth is, you're always met with negative reactions. But then, in all honesty, there are some people who are willing to come to the table and talk to you. But then what then happens is sometimes talk is talk, people talk to you and then they go do something else. So I think one of the biggest challenge we're facing right now is really with the state, because they're making all these promises to business. Like, I don't know, a few days ago, the president just released a statement talking about how mining has contributed so much to the economy since COVID-19, and that we should encourage investment in mining at this point. And I'm thinking, we need to change that narrative, that you can the economic development comes from mining, and therefore we can let people do the activities with impunity. Because the truth and the reality is that people living in those communities are affected so much, and we're just not doing anything. Well, when someone else comes to fight for them, they are labeled with a negative name, so you can't exactly do much. But I think one of the cases that we are working on that would be crucial, even in terms of climate justice, is a case in the Mpumalanga Highveld as well. It's a proposed underground coal mine that is supposed to be established in a strategic water source area. And this area, in a strategic water source area, is basically like high water yielding area that provides a lot of water, not just to the people in Mpumalanga, but to at least 3 other provinces in South Africa. And it also crosses over to Swaziland and Lesotho, giving South Africa international obligations to protect that water source. And yet they want to establish a coal mine. So one of the narratives we always get is coal mining does not have any contribution or much of a contribution to climate change. But that is not true, because science has also said that methane is produced when you mine coal, and the impact of methane is actually far more dangerous, because the greenhouse gas emissions, it does have a huge contribution to climate change. But you see government, they keep authorizing coal mines all across the country and then at the same time, they're making these climate change commitments. When you mine that coal, what are you expecting to do with it? You're going to burn it. When you burn the coal, what are you doing? Exacerbating climate change. But when someone else comes to say these things, you're labeled as anti-poor and anti-development. So I do like the idea that was being talked about by the other 2 panelists about how there's conflicting mandates and conflicting interests. Where government says one thing, they probably go to COP26 and then they say one thing, they come back to South Africa and they're doing another thing. You see the president establishing a climate change commission, but then what his other ministers are doing is completely opposite to that. So how do you make sure that everyone's interests are aligned? I think that's the challenge that we have in South Africa right now, because businesses are being promised by government certain things, and they come in from other countries to try and do this thing that government is saying, come in, you can mine here. But then now there's this issue around how do we address climate change in South Africa? Your development is going to affect us, and then there's like a whole conflict that is arising, and government, I don't think they know how to deal with that. So the best way to deal with the challenge is to blame the people who are trying to raise awareness around it and educate people that actually this is not good for you. You need to stand up for your rights.
Thanks. It reminds me of another part of the charter, the Climate Justice Charter, which says a carbon-free society and effective life-supporting systems coming from the earth mean emancipation for all, including for future generations, from our current ecocidal system. This is the struggle of our time and our historical task as South Africans, as humans and as part of the wider living earth community. And I find that very appropriate to the idea that responding to carbon intensive industry is anti-poor is really disappointing. Tasneem, I wanted to let you close us out for the panel portion of the discussion, just by giving your thoughts on how can we be more responsive and proactive in view of the challenges that Retumetse and Tatenda have just been speaking about, as well as some of the challenges you've highlighted.
Thanks, Melanie. I think that, you know, and it's probably good to conclude the conversation with all its complications and different entry points with, so what can we do as a country? And I think one of the most important things, and there's work that's been done in different spaces, including, you know, through the Planning Commission, the National Planning Commission at that time, and now also the Presidential Commission. And that is to have a nationally driven just transition process to develop the plans for that. Exactly for the reasons that Rometse raises earlier about what a complicated country we are. And such a process of planning for this just transition has to be inclusive. It's not going to be decided by the NBI alone with the modeling and all that sectoral work that they're doing, which is really great. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's the business sector's contribution. But you are going to have to ensure justice. And here, the just transition is used very loosely. But the word just in the just transition is what we emphasize in South Africa. And to ensure justice, you're going to have everybody at the table. The impacted communities in Mpumalanga, for example, who are suffering from deadly air, are suffering a huge injustice. They have to be at the table when the ESCOMs decide what we're going to do when they close down coal-fired power stations, close down mines, which is inevitable and needs to happen. They have to be at the table about, so what does that future look like? And so the process of planning this just transition, the outcomes of that just transition are all needing to ensure that it is truly just. And again, I come back to the original point and the point of the webinar. The unfinished business in this country is to address poverty and inequality. To achieve a just outcome, you will have to make addressing poverty and inequality a central part of the outcomes for a just transition. So for me, in this complicated context, as was said, and for us to, in fact, move from this point of the nature of our economy, the system that we've adopted as a country, etc., that keeps us in this crisis, to shift from that to that just future, which is part, I think, of that unfinished business. And for us to finish that off, we have to have a just transition, for sure. An inclusive, participatory, truly democratic, truly transparent process that is not driven in the boardrooms alone, in government offices, that is not seen as a technical exercise. It's a deeply, deeply political process, social process, and as power and vested interests involved as well. So that's to you, Melanie, my answer for how do we get out of all of this? Through a truly, deeply just transition process.
Thanks. We'll move into the question and answer session now. It's very inspiring. I'll hand over to Natasha for that purpose. Thanks.
Thanks, Melanie. And also, you should feel free to answer. You know, you are as much of an expert on this as everyone else. So I'm not, unless the person has specifically said, Tasneem, please answer this. Anyone can answer these questions. So I'll start off with the first one from David. What do you want your friends and allies in the international community to do to ensure that South Africa, Southern Africa, and the global South do not bear the brunt of the financial costs of climate change? Again, open to the panel. Tasneem.
Two things. One, please just fulfill the commitments that you've made to provide finance to the global South, to developing countries. And in fact, please, you need to scale that up now. 100 billion, for example, of public finance committed 10 years ago, just given the scale of the problem and the costs involved, we need that to be scaled up. So that's the first thing. And particularly, give funding to deal with the losses and damage already being experienced because of the global crisis and being experienced exactly by the people that we've been talking about, that Melanie's pointed out, by the poor and the marginalized. Those are the people who are suffering losses and damage caused by a crisis, caused by those in the North, mostly rich developed nations. The second that I would like to say is, please stop your governments from extracting in Africa, or your companies from extracting in Africa. The biggest unbelievable, immoral, unethical act right now on our doorsteps is what they're planning to do in Okavango. The pipeline in East Africa. You know, these are foreign companies coming in and doing exactly what they did during the times of colonialism, partitioned Africa, extracted the resources. They're doing it again. This is a new form of colonialism. And these fossil fuel investments, offshore investments, here on our shores, must stop. And the International Energy Agency, in their recent report on a 1.5 net zero pathway for energy, made it very clear that all new investments in new fossil fuel production must stop now in 2021. That's what they said. That's a conservative body, the International Energy Agency. So yeah, what should our allies in the North do? Put pressure on your governments and on your companies to stop seeing developing countries as dumping grounds and fulfill the commitments that have already been made, is my short answer.
That being said, though, what do we as average South Africans do to stop our government from allowing these companies to come in and, you know, pillage our land? You again, Tasneem, or anyone again. Sorry, Tasneem did answer. Melanie?
Well, yeah. I also wanted to say in response to David's question that we need friends and allies in the global North to also hold the multinational corporations whose shareholders sit in the global North to account. So when they are committing crimes in the global South, we need the global North to hold those companies to account, and to use all the mechanisms that are available to do that, because obviously it's very hard for South Africans to incur the costs and the resources of accountability here. And so it would be a big help if you could promote that in any spaces where you're able to promote it. But as ordinary South Africans, I think one of the big things we need to promote is awareness of the interconnected nature of climate change and social justice. And I think we also need to, as middle-class South Africans, we need to stop blaming the poor and demonizing the poor for a lot of the problems we're seeing in our country. And I see this in the news all the time. The discourse is that the poor are to blame. And we need to start pointing the finger in the right direction. And that's also pointing it at ourselves. Acknowledging that some of the ways in which we live, where we have choices, need to change. Some of the things we take for granted, we need to adjust. Even the way we eat, the way we consume energy. And I think that's something that we really need to take a lot more seriously in terms of educating ourselves and stopping pointing the finger at the poor.
You know, you say the way we eat, and maybe you want to elaborate on that, but it's so difficult to be just a person in a household and being I recycle, I whatever, and then when the literal ocean is on fire, you know that's not you. It's not because of your use of straws, you know, that the ocean is burning. So how do we make sure that people understand that even though we're doing our part, there's still more we can do on an individual and community level? Have we lost the sense of community, that we're actually all responsible for each other? Is that what it is? Or when you see the ocean on fire, you're just like, I know it's not me because I recycle, so it's not my business.
Well, I think if I can elaborate a little bit, individual choices are obviously only a small part of the problem, but they are, for those of us who have choice, they are a big part of the problem. And so the ocean is on fire in large part because of industrial scale fishing. It's one of the biggest threats to the ocean, and any of us that eats fish that isn't sourced from subsistence fishers are part of the problem. And any of us that eats food without reflecting on where does our food come from and what is its impact on the planet is part of the problem. And so making better choices is one way we can influence the producers to adopt better practices. It's obviously one small way. And the big problem is the multinational corporations, the system of capitalism that they are part of. But we are part of that system too. And those of us who have choices need to make better ones.
Tatenda?
Yeah, I think just to add on what Melanie just said, I would like to go back to the point where people were discussing about how South Africa is a complex country. And the reality is that there is poverty in South Africa and there's inequality. So as individuals, we can only do so much, but we do need to point the fingers in the right direction. But then one thing that always comes back is the issue around poverty. How do we resolve it? Because that is in existence. So one of the challenges that we face, even in practice, when we're trying to stop a particular development is, so what are people going to eat? Because look at their living conditions. They need jobs, they need food, they need houses, and this mining development is going to give them that. So now you're faced with a challenge where you need to stop a particular development because of the detrimental effects it has on these people who are living in this present generation and those who are going to come, like from generations that will come. But how do you balance that? Because the reality is poverty is there. These people need something. And at this point, it looks like this disruptive development is going to help them. So even if individuals are doing certain things, the truth is there's something else that as an individual, you can't resolve alone. You know, people with power like government, they need the political will to actually do something, go to those people and say, you know, we are not offering this disruptive thing, we are going to offer you something that will sustain your lives and the lives of your grandchildren. But that is not happening. Government is not doing the job that they're supposed to do because there's this there's a lack of political will and people with conflicting mandates. I mean, an interesting case in point is a few months ago when the premier of Mpumalanga came out saying, oh, we're going to be initiating green initiatives in Mpumalanga to sort of transform it into a green economy. And then a few sentences after that, she says, oh, we welcome a new coal mine that's going to happen. And she's just talking about it. It's like so contradictory, right? Like, do you want this to be a green economy or are you sticking to what you know? So I guess that I don't think as individuals we can do much to stop this. I think what we can do as a collective group is to put pressure to where the responsibility lies, put pressure on government to do what they're supposed to do, put pressure on corporates to do what they're supposed to do. And one of the things we need to do in order to ensure that is to raise awareness, to go to those poor people and tell them, we understand you need jobs, but this is not going to help you. There are other things that can help you. And then you sort of discuss these things with them. If people understand, it's easier to mobilize and then point fingers in the right direction. But if they don't, it's also quite difficult. So I think that's where individuals can come in. If you are woke enough to understand these issues, try to educate another person so that all of us know and we're able to march in the right direction.
I think the point, yes, Tasneem.
Sorry, I really, and just recalling that we in a Tambo Foundation webinar, I think that there are far more fundamental issues. The kind of notion that, government has to do things, the corporates have to do things, and as citizens, we should either change our lifestyle or we should put pressure on them, is fundamentally different to the kind of the country that we were fighting for. We fought for our freedom as collective peoples in a participatory and democratic way on the ground, using our power. Now, what are we saying? We have no power. We are not having agency to contribute to the changes that need to come. So I would just add to what Tatenda says, that yes, government must do that. But what happened to the idea of participatory democracy, where you go and sit with communities and talk about, so what solutions can we collectively bring to bear? Not government has to come and do this and, we sit without agency. We really have to reclaim our agency, our power. And let me say, I've worked in communities, and let us not pretend that communities don't have solutions. They're just not being valued. They're not just being acknowledged. Communities have solutions for all of these things. I've been to Mpumalanga, for example, those communities who have had an unbelievable injustice brought about them. They want to do things, alternative livelihoods, sustainable farming, whatever. The waters have been poisoned. The soil has been poisoned. They have health problems, so then what do? There's an injustice that's been brought to bear. Bring people to a table. Let's talk about the alternative. Let's talk about, so what will the mining companies do to rehabilitate their mines? What will you do to rehabilitate the soils, clean up the water, etc.? We have solutions as communities. So I do want to say, I would really not like to relegate ordinary citizens to we are passive and we're going to just need government to do this and that and the other, because our history has been a different one. Our history has been one of people have power, and we have to go back to that. And it is through the power of our people, through the agency of our people, that we can bring about the kind of changes that we need to bring about. And government needs to respect their citizens as people who are going to contribute to that future. Government doesn't have all the answers either, and neither do the corporates. So yes, this is about all of us being there to exercise our collective responsibilities.
I think also the point is that not to compare, but in fighting for freedom, there was one thing we knew, you know, this is the one cause. And now, you know, we're fighting for vaccines, we're fighting against poverty and inequality, we're fighting for education, we're fighting for women's rights, we're fighting for, you know, anti-GB. There's so many fights, I think, that we're fighting on so many different fronts that South Africans are exhausted. And we have possibly forgotten that we do know how to mobilize and have agency. And the point is not to talk at poorer communities, it's to talk with poorer communities, and like you say, get out some of those what will be wonderful solutions, but you know, not have a trickle down effect of government telling poor people and marginalized communities what to do. But I'm gonna move on because there's many questions. Oh, David said his home city is in Glasgow. So David, you must go to Glasgow for COP26 and tell them this is what we said here at the Tumble Foundation webinar. George says, thank you for your comments and insights around the issue from a policy and legislative point of view, especially for someone like me that tends to take a technical and practical perspective on some of the impacts, such as the video of the flooding. I want to echo the panelists' view that the solution to the impacts of climate change are inextricably linked to solutions that would address poverty, but this needs to be addressed in a holistic manner to ensure the solutions that are put in place are sustainable. I think it's exactly what we were just talking about. He then says, do you think that the government sector, specifically the scientific institutions, have the capacity and the skills in the right places to contribute towards addressing the deficiencies in the system? Anyone?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think South Africa, particularly in this area, has got excellent skills and expertise. So you've got a number of authors that have contributed to your international reports that are coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You've got institutions that are doing work on, for example, ocean and land modeling. It's a very complex modeling around understanding the climate. And so I don't think that necessarily is the scientific expertise where the issue sits, and even in the social sciences, there is a disconnect to a large extent, I do believe, between the policies, so the policies, politics, and the science. I mean, it also happens in business. So where we need to focus is making sure that more of that knowledge and insight is translated and heard where it needs to be heard in those corridors of power and where we're making decisions, and that it's held up as something that is robust and objective, so we can't run away from it. So this is what I think really needs to happen. We have some of, I think, even on the continent, particularly on the modeling, and we've got superb expertise and skills, but it's how we actually use those skills and those insights and allow them to influence the way that the country's going, and to bring them into that conversation.
Anyone else? Thanks, Rita. No? Okay, let's move on. Vivian says, would education for women and girls not also be a mitigation strategy as well as an adaptation measure? Melanie.
I mean, I think education and raising awareness is a huge part of climate change adaptation, more so than mitigation, but adaptation strategies, certainly. So building resilience. But I also think that whenever we speak of education, I always think of how little I know about how to respond to climate change in my own life. And, I've literally done a doctorate on the law related to it, and there's so little that I know. And in fact, to me, a lot of the solution is around rejecting the existing ways of living, the online shopping, all the wasteful and harmful things that so many of us do, and trying to learn from women and children in rural communities. How do they grow their food? What can we do to support them, and what can we learn from them in the ways in which we live our life? And aren't livelihoods a lot more important than the ways that we live and exist? So there's many questions that I have for rural women and children. But of course, education is something that we need to do collectively in an inclusive and participatory way, as Tasneem has already pointed out. So certainly, I don't think that it's just a one-way thing. And I think a lot of the solutions around a just transition are done without proper consultation and become ineffective precisely because of that, because the different problems people experience in communities are not taken into account, because the experts who are going in to deliver those solutions aren't aware of the problems on the ground. So I don't know that answers Vivian's question. I think we all need to educate ourselves and we need to do it collectively.
I mean, I completely hear what you're saying, but for example, I live in an apartment. There's no ways I'm growing crops to feed myself, in my kitchen, on my windowsill garden, So I think, yes, we definitely do need to, like we said, engage rural communities. But again, it comes down to especially, being a middle-class South African, what am I doing? What are my own individual choices that I can control that are fitting for my own lifestyle,
So I think I would say in response to that we're using the logic that's caused the problem to solve it. We don't have to grow crops in our individual apartments, right? There's so much unused land in South Africa. There's, if you think of how many golf courses there are in Johannesburg, and who gets access to those, and what some of that land, so as not to cause a war, could be used towards in terms of growing food, if not only for our consumption, but for people in our community, and for the benefit of people in our community. So I think your discussion on land it will be relevant as well in this space. But often we think it has to be all or nothing. I can't grow anything other than a pot of basil, which I can't keep alive for more than a couple of weeks, so I'm not going to do anything. But it certainly doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to think in a binary way about solutions, and we don't have to use the logic that caused the problem to solve it.
Tasneem, anything to add?
Yeah, so maybe just to come back to the education and mitigation story. Look, I do think that, of course, as the new economy and the new society that we're hoping to transition towards requires new skills and new capacities and capabilities, right? And so it will be, of course, really important that the education, and especially of women and girls, would have to contribute to that new society and new economy. And so investing in that education, in fact, our curriculum has to change fundamentally as well, so that we can already start, we talk a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, and it's all about that kind of future. But this future of being carbon free, of being non-extractive, of, doing the kinds of living completely different lifestyles, etc., that future that we sometimes call green future, we must give it another name maybe, because maybe green isn't the correct one, but that kind of egalitarian future, that needs to be built off certain capabilities. And yes, so I would agree with Vivian that the kinds of competencies and skills for women and children, also in the way we mitigate. And a simple example, we want to shift our energy system from dirty, polluting to green and renewable, that sector is going to need capacity and skills, right? And so, yes, I mean, it's just totally agree with the point that's being made. It's education is important on all fronts. You know, it's not just a adaptation, mitigation issue. It's on all fronts. It's going to be absolutely fundamental to invest in sustained and good new education systems.
Tatiana?
If I can just add a bit to that, there's been quite some research around how women and girls, especially in the rural areas, they work a lot with land and water and providing food and servicing care for people. So I do think that educating them will actually be a very good way towards mitigation of climate change. And also, it's not just about educating them, but it's also about bringing them to the table, just going back to what Tasneem was talking about, having an inclusive just transition. It's more, it will work much better if you're bringing that woman, that girl who works every single time on land or who deals with water all the time, like people on the ground, to come to the table and tell you what exactly you need to do for them and for everybody else. So I do think educating them, but also allowing them to educate you on what they go through every single day is something that will be a useful tool in mitigating climate change.
Thank you. Richmond, anything to add? She there. She looks frozen. Smart. Okay, let me ask. Oh, shame she disappeared. There's another question. Is there anything that can be done with regard to stopping the possible fracking off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal by Sasol for oil and gas exploration? Ooh, Ritzmenta, you're back. I'm going to just repeat that question just in case you didn't get it. Is there anything that can still be done with regard to stopping the possible fracking off the coast of KZN by Sasol for oil and gas exploration? And actually, I'm just going to hand it over to you to begin with, Ritzmenta.
Yeah, Mrs. But I do not know all the details, but I think just to hark back to what Tasneem has said, we do have a democracy, and there are various mechanisms that are in place to tend to get the voice of the people in, whether it's mobilizing directly, affected communities in particular. But I do think that through processes like your environmental impact assessments, some of the work around, what goes into priority government projects at a local government level and what have you. I think those are the easiest mechanisms that are available for those who have any particular kind of protests to be able to articulate their voice. I think, just even having to tender here that part of our democracy is having a strong legal system that does allow people.
The signal is a bit bad.
To be able to challenge and to be able to stand up for the,
We're battling to hear you. Your signal's a bit tricky. Where did she go? Tasneem or Melanie, do you want to add to the fracking question?
I can just add to say that when any permit is granted to allow fracking, so fracking's been added as of 11 June this year to the lists of activities that require an environmental authorization. And that represents a massive shift from the previous way that fracking was going to be regulated, which was in terms of a huge suite of regulations that was specifically designed to address all the potential environmental harms of fracking. And what we see now is you apply for a permit like you would any other environmentally harmful activity. But when the companies such as Sasol, and again, I don't know the details of this particular development in inverted commas, but when a company such as Sasol does that, there's a public participation process that's required by law. And so without wanting to give legal advice in this platform, the appropriate thing to do is to participate, so to make comments about the harmful nature of the activity and any mitigation. So mitigation meaning reducing the impacts, the harm of that activity. So any way in which those harms can be reduced and managed or prevented, and mobilizing the community in response to the harms. And I think Tatenda can speak a lot more to those kinds of actions on the part of communities.
Tatenda?
Sorry, I think I got kicked out.
We would never do that, but welcome back.
Okay. But can you just repeat what the question was? I might have missed.
We're asking about if there's anything that can be done with regard to the possible fracking off the coast of KZN for oil and gas exploration, I think by Sasol.
Okay, I don't particularly know anything around that, but I do think there was a couple of years ago, there was something around fracking in the Karoo, and people did submit objections around that, and they pressured government to actually like issue a moratorium to stop that for a while until we know what exactly we want to be doing here. So I do think there are a lot of tools that people can use. For example, depending on where the project is, if it's at the beginning point, then they're supposed to be doing public participation processes where people can participate in and submit objections or what their concerns are and ask to be made part of the process. And this is a very useful tool for a lot of people. I mean, I know a lot of communities, they miss this point, and then to come back later and say, we didn't want this, it's like, but we had a participation process, why didn't you do anything? So I do think that's the first port of call for you, like try to find out where, if such thing is happening, when it's happening, and how you can participate. But then also education, like just raising awareness to people on how this will affect their lives and why it shouldn't go ahead, or if it should go ahead, on what terms it should go ahead. But generally, I just think in the era of climate change, we shouldn't be going into fossil fuels anyway. So that can be something you can do even on an advocacy level.
Thank you. Does Naeem anything to add about fracking?
To that question specifically, in addition to everything else Melanie and Tatenda's raised, and about the processes, etc. You know, there's a very active citizenry in Durban and in KwaZulu-Natal. So, you know, get involved. Go and join up organizations who are actually working in the space of stopping fossil fuel projects, etc., fighting air pollution. So I know that there's a very, very strong organizational base there. Join up. Get part of a collective push if you want to stop the fracking thing. There's the process, there's litigation, there's also organizing.
Oh, goodness. Roberta. Roberta's asked, how do we change the broader community's attitude that dumping waste becomes a source of job creation? Furthermore, the artisanal mining is not being regulated. Municipalities are allowing this to happen all over, and these holes are being left for others to deal with. Then they then become dumping sites for others. We need to prevent small business, to follow the path of large businesses. We need to educate them to do things correctly rather than allowing them to just do it because it has been done in the past. So I remember when I was little and someone would litter and we'd all yell job creation. I really hope that isn't still the thinking of people 30 years later, that if you litter or dump waste, that's a source of job creation. Rutamete, have you heard of that?
Yeah, I have heard of that, but I must admit, I think it's people perhaps not taking full advantage of their responsibility. So I do think it's a bit of a facetious comment. I must also acknowledge, particularly when it comes to waste management, that South Africa as services and kind of management around that is not optimal. So you do find a lot of communities who don't have kind of options around better ways of managing their waste because the services are not being provided. And perhaps that's speaking to that bigger conversation about making sure that South Africa transitions and addressing poverty and access to services as others have it. But I think more broadly as well as an economy, just understanding the value that there is in managing our waste. I think it's quite ironic that we're pointing to many communities because the people that you often see on the streets picking up, sorting through waste and traveling, with huge loads, early hours of the morning in the cold and what have you, are the very same people that we often blame, who are showing others what value there is in actually managing the waste properly and the waste streams and how we're actually supposed to be behaving in terms of sorting the waste and taking it to the relevant facility. So I think this is one of the situations where perhaps we do need to copy those people who are showing us how waste can be in some ways monetized and having a benefit broadly for the environment. And be able to support those kinds of systems and those approaches and make it easier for communities to be able to participate in ventures like that.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Yeah, no, I want to support Ramutse. I think that the question, I couldn't figure it out actually, but the system, the system of provision of basic services has failed. And if you can just drive it, I'm from Cape Town, drive around, please go and look at what's happening in our poor communities and the waste that is just, there's the system of basic municipal services failing poor people.
Yeah.
Now, in a context like that, and I know, the informal waste pickers association, for example, have organized themselves to look at as was said, how one then uses this opportunity to make a living. So don't blame the waste pickers, right? They're making a livelihood. It's those generating waste. And then it's those who are not actually dealing with the basic services in terms of waste management. So we cannot be guilty of doing what was done in the Blukombos video, blame the poor, right? Who are just wanting to survive, in fact.
Yeah.
And so that question was a bit worrying. I'm not sure if that was the intention. And I'm not sure about all the holes and other things. We need to come back and put these things in perspective. Do not blame, don't talk about we need to educate communities. What we need to do is provide communities with the basics, address especially poor communities, address those basic services, look at how we can provide opportunities, address inequality. And so I would be very reluctant to say we blame communities, we need to educate communities. That is very patronizing, actually, and not fair and not just. So I'm sorry if I'm responding in quite a hard way, but there's too much of that sentiment in our country where people turn around and blame the poor for this, that, and the other. And please let us recall our own unsustainable lives, consumption and then waste. So yeah, let's put all of these things in perspective as well.
Yeah, I can on the point of artisanal mining is that it's certainly a problem because it's the people who are doing it are at risk when they engage in those mining practices, and there is a need for regulation and protection of artisanal miners. And what worries me is when we think of illegal miners, we think of small-scale miners, whereas the bulk of illegal mining happening in our country that's caused the vast majority of pollution to our water and air systems is from legal mining and is from multinational corporations that have extracted coal and gold and all sorts of other things, platinum, and taken the proceeds of that to the global north. And so when we think of illegal miners, we should be thinking first and foremost of the CEOs of those multinational corporations and not the artisanal miner who's unregulated, yes, but is such a small part of the problem and who needs protection, empowerment, and yes, some regulation to achieve that. And so I think it's about a bit of a paradigm shift for me. I've commented in writing around some of the waste management comments. Of course, all of us must take responsibility for our waste, but we must also reflect on who's generating all this waste, and why is it being generated.
The person who asked the question clarified, and she said, she's not blaming anyone. She's trying to find a solution to a major problem in smaller cities where they don't have waste management systems like we do in major cities. So just to clarify that. I think the last question to all of you is it too late? Are we too late to save the world from a climate crisis? And in your answer, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to start with you, Tatenda. We began with you. It's only fair to end with you.
Well, I don't think it's too late. If we start to act now, we can actually help in solving some of the problems. It's only going to be too late if we keep this mentality that, well, you know, maybe 2050 is still so far. Truth is 2050 is next year. So we need to start acting now. Our house is on fire. Let's start acting now. If we don't, then it's going to be too late, and there's going to be a dead planet. We're all not going to be here anyway. So I do think at this point it's not too late. We just need to make sure that we do what we're supposed to do. You know, our policies align with our actions. If we do that, I think we can solve part of the problem. Maybe not all of it, but at least we'll get somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Ritumete?
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree. It's not too late, and it's incumbent upon us to act with urgency, but also with courage and being bold. And it's something that we need to do together. And it's something that needs to happen, not even as soon as possible, but immediately.
Thank you. Thank you. Tasneem?
So absolutely, it's not too late. And like everybody else says, you know, the science is very clear. By the end of this decade, not 2050, this decade. That's the time frames we're talking about.
9 years from now.
9 years from now. Yep, exactly. 9 years from now, Natasha, we will have to act to half our global emissions by then, right? So it does require bold action. It does require courage. And I don't think, you know, just the decision makers, governments living through this period of compounding crises can turn their eyes away and ignore that we're dealing with multiple crises and they need to act faster, more urgently, and more radically, more boldly. And so, yes, the time frame is not 2050. Let me please remind everybody that it's not 2050. It's actually now, in 9 years' time. What we do now determines what happens in 2050. And so, yeah, I'm very optimistic. I believe there's so much of this crisis that cannot be ignored any longer. We just came through a week. I don't know how you felt about last week, but it felt pretty apocalyptic to me, right? You know, that kind of big, the thing that Melanie showed, the gas pipeline fire in the Gulf of Mexico, what happened in Chile, the heat dome in the northwest of America and people dying, and the mudslide in Japan. I mean, it was just back to back
crises.
Yeah, it's crazy. You cannot ignore it any longer. So I believe our leaders and all of us will realize that we have to act. And so I'm optimistic that we can avoid this crisis.
I love that you can
minimize
it. Say all of that and then say, I'm still optimistic. That's amazing. Melanie.
I would say it's not too late, provided each one of us is willing to be deeply uncomfortable. And possibly as uncomfortable as an artisanal miner when they're crawling into a hole that's been left by a multinational corporation that was extracting gold. Because if we don't get uncomfortable and if we carry on with a business as usual approach, it is too late. And we are facing the next mass extinction. And so if we do get uncomfortable, and we can all start by reducing our meat consumption significantly, reducing our fish consumption significantly, reducing the amount of waste we produce, changing our attitudes about consumption and the idea that we need new things all the time. And yes, that's uncomfortable for all of us. But if we don't do that, then it is too late. And so it will take radical transformation at the level of business, government, and individuals, and the way we treat each other. But there is hope if we can do that.
Thank you guys so much from the foundation side. I'm going to quickly hand over to our final speaker for today from ABSA, who's our partner, as you know, but from our side, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Natasha. Good afternoon, everyone. Please allow me, on behalf of ABSA Group and the Oliver and Adelaide Tambo Foundation, to thank you all for a really great conversation that we've had this afternoon. I wish to express my sincere thanks to all the panelists. Ladies, please allow me to say that you were really, really fantastic. You approached climate change from a variety of different backgrounds, but you all have helped to shine a light on the need to alter the decisions that we make today in order to build a society that holds climate justice as a key guiding principle. I would like to commend and offer deep gratitude to our program director, Melanie, for providing a great steer. I would also like to convey our thanks to our online audience for their active participation and inputs. I wish to thank the acting CEO of the foundation, Natasha, and my colleague, Viwe Tlaliane, for their commitment to ensuring that we do find the time to engage in candid and even sometimes really uncomfortable dialogue. Tatenda and Tasneem, I agree with you. This is a problem that needs all hands on deck, and with all of us as equal social partners. Together, we can do a great deal more, and that's not just a cliche. Part of this discussion today has focused on the role of business. I wish to just share with you that as a founding signatory of the Principles for Responsible Banking at the 2019 UN General Assembly, ABSA has made a commitment to strategically align its business with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. Once more, everybody, thank you for participating in this important discussion, and I wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us, and please follow us, like I said, at Tambo Foundation across all social media platforms, and we will be posting the YouTube link to this recording for anyone who wasn't able to join us today. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.